close your eyes for a moment and let me take you to a city that feels impossible to conquer. A city braced between two seas, stitched to two continents, crowned with walls that have turned away armies for 1,000 years. You can smell salt from the Marmara, damp earth from the trenches, and a sharp tang of gunpowder that hangs in the wind like a warning. You hear prayers in dozens of accents, the groan of ships at anchor, and, above everything, the slow, monstrous breathing of the great cannon as it prepares to speak. If you were standing beside me in the spring of 1453, you'd feel the ground tremble under your boots, and you'd understand something immediately. This is not just a siege. It's a turning of the world. It's ambition given shape. Timber, rope, iron, stone, and driven forward by a young sultan who believes history itself can be forced to kneel. I'm going to tell you what I saw, what I carried, and what I feared, not as a distant legend, but as a man inside the dust and noise, one soldier among many, pressed up against the Theodosian Walls, watching an empire's last breath fog the air at dawn. Quick note before we begin. If you haven't subscribed to my channel yet, subscribe now and make sure to like this video. It genuinely helps me continue bringing you stories like this. And if you want the next part, I need you with me. Part 1. The Road to the Walls. You ask what it was like to be there. So let's start before the first stone was fired, when the conquest was still a plan carried in men's mouths like prayer. I was not born in Istanbul. Back then we called it Constantinople, with a kind of cautious respect. I came from the western lands of the empire, from villages where the wind smells of wheat and river mud. But the call went out across Rumelia and Anatolia. The Sultan was gathering a host, and the target was the city that sat like a locked chest on the Bosporus. We marched toward Edirne first, the old Ottoman capital, a staging ground of roads and depots. If you were with me, you'd remember the sound of it. Iron rings clinking on harnesses, hooves hitting hard-packed earth, the creak of wagons stacked with sacks of grain and coiled rope. Edirne felt like a living machine. Scribes counting provisions, armorers repairing mail, imams speaking to lines of young men who tried not to look afraid. And then there was the cannon. I want you to picture this clearly. Not a neat little weapon, but a giant, cast in bronze, thick as a tree trunk, longer than a man is tall. The master founders, some say a Hungarian named Urban among them, had created bombards that could throw stone balls heavier than anything I'd ever imagined. We watched the crews test the fittings, smear grease on axles, and pray over the metal as if it were a creature that might bite them. Moving those cannons was its own campaign. You can't drag a mountain of bronze across the countryside without paying in sweat and time. Oxen strained in teams, men jammed timbers under wheels, and when the roads softened after rain, everyone pushed. If you had been there, you'd have felt the shameful relief when you were assigned to escort and security instead of hauling. But even then, you never slept easily. A stalled cannon was an invitation for sabotage. As we moved east, the land began to change. Hills tightened, forests thickened, and the air gained that maritime dampness that tells you a great body of water is near. Then one day, the Bosporus revealed itself, dark, fast, and narrow, like a river that decided to become a sea. The currents there are tricky. Even fishermen respect them. Standing above it, you understand why this strait is power. Whoever controls it controls the throat between worlds. That's why the Sultan had built Rumeli Hisara, This was before the siege, a brutal statement in stone on the European side of the Bosporus, facing Anadolu Hizra on the Asian shore. Together, they pinched the waterway. If you were beside me on the hillside, you'd see how the fortress towers bite into the skyline, new, sharp-edged, and confident. It was designed not just to fight ships, but to make a promise. No help would reach the city by sea without paying a price in blood. When we finally approached Constantinople, it didn't rise like a normal city. It rose like a continent of masonry. First, the outer fields and gardens, then the walls. The famous Theodosian Walls, layered and deep, with a moat, an outer wall, and the massive inner wall that seemed to hold up the sky. Even from a distance, you could see damage from old earthquakes and repairs, but don't mistake that for weakness. Those walls had absorbed centuries of war. Our camp spread across the land outside the city, especially along the western land walls from the Marmara shore up toward the district of Edirne near the Golden Horn. Tents multiplied like mushrooms after rain. Fires dotted the night like fallen stars. You'd hear different languages, Turkish, Greek, spoken by converts, Balkan tongues, Arabic prayers. The Janissaries kept their discipline quieter and sharper than the rest. The irregulars bragged more loudly, as if noise could replace courage. And then the city answered us, not with words, but with bells. From within the walls came church bells and chanting. You could not always see the people, but you felt them like a presence behind stone. At night, the city's skyline was a jagged line of domes and towers. Hagia Sophia, though distant, seemed to sit at the center like a heart. That first week, we dug. Trenches, batteries, firing platforms. We measured ranges, stacked stone shot, prepared powder. Every shovel full of earth was a declaration. We are staying. And in the quiet moments, when the sea wind blew in and made the tent snap, you'd notice something else. A chain. Across the Golden Horn, the defenders had stretched a massive chain to block ships from entering. It lay like a metal boundary between their hope and our plans. The Sultan rode the line, sometimes young but composed, surrounded by advisors and guards. When he passed, men straightened, as if pulled by strings. You could feel the momentum in the army. We weren't just encamped, we were aimed. And in my chest, beneath the leather and wool, I carried a small, private fear that the walls would hold, and that we would be buried in these fields like so many others before us. But the cannons were being positioned, the powder was dry, and the city, proud, ancient, was finally within reach of Ottoman hands. Part 2. Thunder, Stone, and the Long Days. If you want the siege in one word, it's this: noise. The first major bombardments felt like the earth was tearing open. The great bombard spoke slowly. It needed time to load, to tamp powder, to position the stone ball. But when it fired, you didn't just hear it. You felt it in your ribs, as if your bones had been struck like a drum. The smoke rolled out thick and oily, carrying a bitter scent that made your eyes water. From the city, the defenders answered with their own artillery, smaller, quicker pieces. And then there were arrows, bolts, stones flung from mangonels, and the constant whistle of things meant to kill you. If you were beside me on the firing line, you'd learn quickly not to stare at the walls for too long. The walls stare back. Our section worked near the central land walls, where the ground allowed artillery to be brought forward. The Byzantines, Romans they called themselves, were not many, but they were stubborn and skilled. Their repairs were relentless. Every night after our cannons cracked a section of outer wall, you'd see lanterns moving along the battlements like fireflies. They would drag stones, timber, sacks of earth. They'd build makeshift palisades behind breaches, turning every gap into a new obstacle. Days blended into a cycle of labor and survival. Bombard, advance the batteries, dig trenches closer, fill the moat in places, test the ground for mines. Mining was terrifying work. Sappers would dig under cover, listening for the enemy digging back. Sometimes you'd hear it, a faint tapping in the earth like death trying to find your address. If the tunnels met, there would be fire, smoke, and screaming in the dark where you couldn't swing a sword properly. Men died underground without ever seeing the sky again. The geography shaped everything. On our left, the Marmara shore curved away, and the sea air carried damp cold at night. On our right, the land rose toward the Golden Horn, where the city's northern defenses and the district of Blashenay complicated any direct assault. The walls there were a patchwork of older and newer structures, still formidable, but different from the long, disciplined stretch of Theodosian masonry. And overhead, the weather was its own commander. Rain turned trenches into mud that sucked at your boots and made hauling ammunition a punishment. Wind could blow smoke back into our faces. When it was clear, the sun reflected off the city's stone in a way that almost mocked us. Bright, clean, unbothered. You asked what I saw. I saw men become older in a week. I saw a friend, barely a beard on his face, laughing at breakfast and dead by afternoon from a splinter of stone that found his neck. I saw surgeons work with rough hands, cutting cloth from wounds, pouring hot oil or wine to clean them, whispering prayers no one wanted to hear. But I also saw discipline become power. The Janissaries moved like a single body. When they advanced, shields aligned, and their officers kept order under fire. They weren't fearless, they were trained. There's a difference. Around them were troops from across the Sultan's realm, cavalry that patrolled supply lines, infantry that dug and fought, engineers that lived among ropes and pulleys, and always the cannons. We learned to watch, for the moment the shot landed, you'd see it, a brief flash of impact, then stone erupting as if the wall itself had spat. Dust would bloom, obscuring everything. Sometimes, when the dust cleared, you'd realize the damage was less than you hoped. Other times, you'd see a crack widen, a section sag, and a cheer would run along our lines like a wave. But the city did not fall just because stone broke. It had to be taken. So assaults began, probing attacks, night raids, attempts to seize forward positions. These were brutal, close, and often pointless except for what they taught. The defenders had crossbows, pikes, and a knowledge of their own walls that made them deadly. They poured stones and burning material down on ladders. They used the height like a weapon. At night, you'd hear Constantinople's prayers echoing over the walls, and then our own prayers answering from the dark fields. Sometimes the wind carried voices so clearly it felt like it, the enemy, was in the next tent. It messes with your mind, the nearness of people you're trying to kill. And the Sultan, he pressured constantly. He wanted momentum. He wanted breaches widened, morale kept sharp, supplies organized, and the navy used. Because the siege was not just a land fight. It was also a matter of water, of the Golden Horn and the Bosporus, of who could choke the city's last roots. We all knew the chain across the Golden Horn was a problem. With it in place, Our ships couldn't enter and strike the northern walls or cut the city's inner harbor lifeline. The defenders had that advantage, and they clung to it. Then rumors started moving through camp. Engineers measuring slopes behind Galata, men speaking about logs and grease, about hauling ships where ships don't belong. At first it sounded like campfire fantasy, but I had seen what the Sultan's engineers could do, and by then I had learned a hard truth. In this siege, the impossible was simply what we hadn't tried yet. Part 3. The Golden Horn Trick and the City's Strain. If you had been with me on the night it happened, you would never forget the sound. Not cannon fire, not shouting. Something stranger. The groan of wood underweight, the scrape of hulls moving over land, and the muffled commands of men trying not to wake an empire. Yes, ships over land. Behind the district of Galata, across from the city's northern shore, our engineers had prepared a route. They laid timber tracks and greased them, turning a hillside into a sliding road. Under cover of darkness, with teams of men and animals hauling, we dragged smaller warships from the Bosporus up and over into the Golden Horn, bypassing the chain entirely. You might think it sounds like a story invented afterward to impress children, but I watched it with my own eyes, mouth dry, heart hammering. The hulls creaked like living beasts. Men strained until their backs looked ready to split. The air smelled of resin, sweat, and the oily grease on the timbers. And then, dawn. When the light rose, the defenders on the city walls saw Ottoman sails in the Golden Horn where they should not exist. It was like watching someone's confidence crack from the inside. You could feel it even across the water. Confusion, alarm, the frantic ringing of bells. Strategically, it changed the geometry of the siege. Now the city had pressure on a second front, on the northern shoreline and harbor defenses. Our ships could threaten supply movement and force the Byzantines to redistribute their already thin manpower. But don't imagine it was an instant victory. The Golden Horn is sheltered, but it is not small, and the defenders still had courage and cunning. They tried fire ships and attacks to burn or disable our vessels. We responded with guards, floating barriers, and constant watch. The harbor became a tense chessboard, oars splashing quietly at night, arrows skipping across water like angry insects. On land, the bombardment never stopped. The walls endured, but they were suffering. Sections collapsed and were rebuilt. The moat filled in places with debris and earth. We pushed trenches closer, sometimes so close you could hear individual voices on the battlements. If you stood where I stood, you would begin to recognize the city's features, not as tourist landmarks, but as tactical problems. The towers that dominated fields of fire, the gates, St. Romanus, Carisius, points where breaches might be forced, the Blackernay area with its complex walls and angles. Each stone had a purpose, and each purpose had to be defeated. Inside the city, we couldn't see everything, but we could infer. A siege is an argument with logistics. Food becomes arithmetic. Water becomes morale. Every day sealed behind walls increases pressure on the defenders' bodies, on their unity, on their belief that help will come. And help did not come in the way they needed. Yes, there were ships, attempts at relief, the wider Christian world watching and debating. But the Bosporus was constrained, and the Sultan's positioning, fortresses, fleets, coastal control, made the city feel isolated. In camp, men spoke of destiny, of prophecy, of the Sultan's promise that Constantinople would be the new capital of an Islamic empire. Yet, For the average soldier, me included, prophecy mattered less than hunger, exhaustion, and the fear of dying anonymously in a ditch. We slept in broken intervals. We cleaned weapons with trembling hands. We learned to eat fast because any moment could become an alarm. There were moments of eerie beauty. I remember one evening when the sun sank behind the city and set the walls glowing amber. Smoke from our guns rose in thin ribbons. The water of the Marmara looked calm, almost gentle, as if it wasn't carrying the weight of history. For a heartbeat, the siege felt unreal, like a painting. Then a cannon fired, and the painting shattered. The Sultan's command tightened as the days passed. He offered terms at times: surrender and live, resist and face ruin. The defenders, led by their emperor Constantine the chose resistance. That decision hardened everything. It meant that when the end came, it would be absolute. We sensed preparations for a final push. More troops were brought forward. Ammunition stockpiles grew. The religious men moved among us, steadying hearts with words. The janissaries polished armor and checked bows and matchlocks. Assault ladders were repaired. Fascines, bundles of brush, were stacked to fill gaps. Engineers marked weak points, and I, one soldier, felt the cold certainty settle in my stomach. We were approaching the kind of night you don't survive unchanged. If you had asked me then, "Do you want this?" I would have answered like a loyal man. But in the dark, alone with my thoughts, I would have told you the truth. I wanted it to be over. Because a siege doesn't just try to take a city. It tries to take the people outside it, piece by piece, until all you are is a tool. And the Sultan was ready to use every tool. Part Parpur, the final assault and the city. After the final assault began before dawn, when the sky was still a deep, bruised blue and the air had that sharp chill that makes you feel painfully alive. They didn't send us all at once. It came in waves. First, the irregular troops, meant to exhaust the defenders, force them to fire arrows and waste strength, reveal positions. The shouting rose like a storm. Drums pounded, horns cried out. The defenders responded with arrows, bolts, stones, and fire. Men fell into the moat, into debris, into each other. The noise was so constant, it stopped being sound and became a physical pressure. Then more organized units pressed forward. Ladders went up, hooks caught stone. The breaches, created by weeks of cannon fire, became the focus. In places where the outer wall had been battered down, the fight turned into a struggle over rubble, where footing was uncertain and every step could expose you. If you were beside me, you'd remember the taste of dust. It coated the tongue, mixed with smoke, and turned each breath into effort. You'd also remember how narrow your world becomes, the shield in front of you, the man at your side, the wall above, the gap you're trying to cross. At some point, the janissaries were committed. That moment changed the character of the assault. The irregulars had been chaos. The janissaries were intention. They advanced with discipline that looked almost unnatural in the screaming dark. You could feel morale shift, ours rising, the defenders straining. And then something happened that you rarely see in war, a crack in the enemy's narrative. There are stories about how exactly the breakthrough occurred, about breaches near the gate of St. Romanus, about fighting near Edirne, about a small gate left open in confusion. In truth, a city falls when multiple pressures align. Fatigue, depleted reserves, breaches that can no longer be sealed, and a moment, just one, when coordination breaks. I remember climbing over shattered stone and seeing the inner defenses pulled thin, men running to plug one gap while another opened. I remember the defenders' faces in torchlight, determined, terrified, exhausted beyond pride. I remember thinking, with a strange calm, they are human, like us. The walls made them seem mythical, but they are human. When we finally gained a foothold, the fight turned inward. Streets, courtyards, alleys, the acoustics changed. Sound bouncing off stone buildings, shouting echoing in confined spaces. The city smelled different inside. Old wood, damp plaster, animals, incense, and fear. And then the skyline that had taunted us from afar was suddenly above us, close enough to touch. Domes and towers weren't symbols anymore. They were terrain. I won't pretend it was clean. It wasn't. A conquest is a violent transition. Some men sought plunder. Officers tried to impose order. The Sultan's authority mattered here because without it, an army becomes a flood that destroys indiscriminately. There were proclamations, attempts to protect key structures, efforts to redirect violence. But in the first hours, control is always imperfect. One of the most searing images I carry is Hagia Sophia. Approaching it felt like approaching a mountain made of stone and faith. The building was enormous, its dome floating above the city like a second sky. Inside, the scale swallowed sound. You could hear footsteps echo like distant knocks. The air was heavy with incense and crowded breath. For the people of the city, it was a place of refuge. For us, it became a symbol of conquest. I remember standing there, not triumphant, but overwhelmed, because you realize then that history is not a storybook. It's a room full of frightened people and armed men. And you are one of the armed men. Later, the Sultan entered the city formally. The atmosphere shifted like a hand closing on the chaos. He was not just taking a prize, he was claiming a capital. Administrators followed. Guards were posted, orders were issued. The conquest became governance in real time. Outside, along the walls, the evidence of our effort was everywhere. Craters, collapsed stone, burned timber, torn earth. The Theodosian Walls, so proud, were scarred and broken in places like a giant that had finally been brought to its knees. The trenches that had been our world were now behind us, irrelevant in a single stroke. If you asked me what I felt in that moment, I would give you an honest answer. Relief, grief, pride, and an emptiness I didn't expect. Relief that I was alive. Grief for friends lost to stones, splinters, and arrows. Pride that we had done what others failed to do. And emptiness because once the impossible city becomes just a city, you realize the siege had filled your entire being, and now there was a hole where that intensity used to live. The geography that had mattered so much, the Golden Horn, the Bosporus currents, the Marmara winds, didn't vanish. It simply changed hands. And that's the heart of it. The city was always a hinge between worlds. In 1453, the hinge swung. When I walk through my memories, I don't see a clean line between heroism and horror. I see men doing what armies do, building, breaking, enduring. I see engineering and faith intertwined with brutality. I see a young sultan forcing reality to match his vision. And I see an ancient empire ending not in a dramatic curtain drop, but in dust, smoke, and the quiet shock of survivors. So when you ask, if you were there, what would you have lived through? This is my answer. I lived through the sound of history being hammered into shape, one cannon shot at a time. And I learned that the price of witnessing a turning point is that it never leaves you. Closing. If you enjoyed this documentary-style story and want more chapters like it, subscribe to the channel and like the video. Your support is what keeps these longer, detailed narrations coming.